So welcome back to the Active Listener, and I'm excited to say that I have Ruchika with me today, who is going to be talking from historical context, and I really want to understand what listening means to her in the impact of the work that she does. So firstly, welcome, Ruchika.
Thank you very much, Mark. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you, and I appreciate the time that you're giving up, and I think today we're really going to be finding some interesting stuff out in the context of history and, as I said, in listening. So could you tell me or tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right. So I work as a communities coordinator, and I work across the University of Cambridge museums. So we have 8 museums, we have the Botanic Garden, and we also work with the library because they do some really amazing work. So I work as a community coordinator as part of a central university museums team, and we are the partnerships team. Now, within that team, we're a small team. We dot across all 8 museums. We sort of develop projects. We come in kind of where we're needed. And within that, we have a smaller team, and we focus specifically on a project which is looking at the legacies of empire and enslavement. And that's where I sort of lead on community engagement. I've been doing that for over a year now. It's been really interesting because I also come from a background where I've done sort of community projects, but I've also been at university, sort of lecturing. I come from a visual literacy and media studies sort of background. So all of that seems to be this hotspot that feeds into my work. Also because the museums are that kind of a visual space, also a space where there is a lot of resources being created and resources being shared. And yeah, so that's me and that's my work.
Excellent, thank you. And what led you into this area of work?
Coming from quite an academic sort of push, while I was sort of doing research, I was teaching and sort of working across the university. And I was at the University of East Anglia and had a really kind of interesting time over there in terms of the projects I got to work on. But while I was there, I actually had someone who served as a mentor who was really helpful, who also started putting my attention towards what we would call outreach. And in my capacity as kind of teaching on modules, sort of working with students, developing sort of small projects with them, I started to work with schools and started to work with communities and work on different kinds of projects with just sort of colleagues around. Then there wasn't a very encouraging push towards doing outreach. It was sort of focused on research and it was focused on teaching because obviously that's what you're gearing towards. But what we started to realize, and it was a whole cohort of us, that all the skills that we were learning as researchers, sometimes they can be quite insular and we talk within this kind of bubble with each other. But we were trying to understand how those skills could translate practically when we sort of go about looking for jobs. And also with the academic circle being so saturated, what are our other options? So started working on some film festivals, on kind of smaller participatory projects, and I really, really enjoyed that. Also because I never saw it as something different to learning. It was, I mean, it would be called alternative learning or alternative education, but it was kind of learning in a different capacity. So I did a bit of that, but at the same time, I was also lecturing. I worked kind of as a lecturer, as an assistant professor. And there again, I had the opportunity to develop projects with my students, and they tended to be kind of visual learning based, pushing them to kind of work with communities, to work with in and also without the kind of academic structure. And while I was doing that, I was also sort of doing workshops outside of kind of work and working with a local kind of confluence where I'm from, where there were photographers and researchers working together to document the culture and history of my region. And it was just, I had my finger in so many pies. It was a really kind of exciting time. And I had that kind of privilege to be able to explore it while I still had a steady job going on. And then I moved, so I was in UK and I moved out. I was in India, which is where I'm from. I worked over there. And then I came back again. And that's where I found myself in this project. I'd like to think it was more intentional than it was. I was sort of looking for a change, and museums have always been a very fascinating space for me, especially because where I grew up, it was a very small hill station, very small town. There must be one sort of museum there. And I think there is that kind of push to document history, to document culture that sometimes is suppressed in so many ways. So I never really had museums growing up. It was only when we went on holiday, then my mom would push me to sort of go to a museum. And it was just this treasure trove of stories that I didn't have access to. And I didn't necessarily feel very welcome in those spaces or feel that my history and culture was being documented. And it was the same when I moved to England as well. It was that similar kind of distance. And I think partly that was what attracted me to this project, that it specifically looked on empire and enslavement. It was specifically meant to be a project that is also has long-term consequences of how it changes museum culture, because there is this massive shift in the heritage industry. And also because it was a space that I felt had been denied to me. So that's how I sort of weaseled my way into this project.
Wow, that's really powerful and really exciting as well. I think there's an interesting point there, because you always hear about history being written by the victors, and there's that who's writing that history, who's presenting thing, in terms of empire, you're conquering these places or liberating, however they would have used. And how is that being recorded through museums? Is through their own eyes? So when we're looking back at history, are we viewing that through a white Western mentality? So I think that's interesting to explore. And then there's the other thing about a lot of artifacts would have been collected like almost as tourism, or I don't want to judge people, because then there may well have been individuals involved out of a genuine concern of logging and understanding and wanting to grow. So I don't want to get in that debate, because I don't know, but I would argue that there would also have been a certain element of, well, we've got this land now and this is great, and I'll hang that up in my huge hall because it looks really nice, perhaps not appreciating the gravity of what that object meant to someone and their family. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you navigate that space of the history that institutions have with the fact that you've got artifacts that would probably have a real meaning to cultures?
Okay, so I'll break that down a bit, and I'll talk
sure
about,
it's a very big question.
It's a big question. It's a really important question. So I'll talk about how I've learned from navigating in that kind of position, because I find that me and my team, we sit in a very kind of interesting position in how we deal with engagement, but also in terms of how we're dealing with our museums and our museum colleagues as well. And then I'll talk about some of the kind of things that the museums are doing, again, positioning themselves in a particular way. So when I started this job, I used to hear a lot about, and I'd visited Cambridge before, this kind of town and gown divide that everybody would keep sort of very freely throwing around, but never really explaining. So I don't think I'd grasped the nuances of that really well. And when I joined this job, I think in my first two, it was online initially because we were still sort of recovering from COVID. But when I started coming into the office, my line manager had suggested, why don't you just take the time to, it's going to be a while. It's going to take you a while to understand the university, the space, but also because the museums are so different. The goal in many ways and the way we want to work can sometimes be similar, but they're just such amazing museums that function in totally kind of different capacities. So while I was sort of walking around, it took me a while, to figure out access to the spaces, because, I kept coming across physical barriers. And then I began to understand that when we talk about collecting and we talk about museum spaces, the focus tends to be on objects and the museum, the physical kind of building. But actually, we're not talking about how difficult it is for our audiences to navigate through Cambridge as a city, and also because we are university museums, we are functioning on a different level sometimes, because we have the university, but then we also have what museums are meant to do, which is for the public. So I began to kind of understand, okay, so we're dealing with kind of looking at our collections, looking at these challenging histories that have sort of been suppressed, histories that haven't been told, and histories now that a lot of our museum colleagues, like curators, collections, learning, outreach, everybody really are working together to try and sort of investigate and explore. But sometimes those tend to be in insular chambers where we're all talking to each other. So there is a lot of work going on, but it's not always public facing. So then we have a lot of audiences coming to us saying that there should be decolonization going on in the museums, and are you doing anything? And are you repatriating anything? So, all these questions. And sometimes it's quite hard because it's not public facing. So we can't assume that people will know the inner workings of a museum, when sometimes even we working in the museums struggle. So we started to understand that, yes, we have to look at our collections, at how we access our museums, but we also have to begin to map out how our communities are mapping the geography in many ways of Cambridge. And where our museums sit are also very interesting in who we say is invited into our space. And that sometimes is in our control. And sometimes because of the way in which the buildings are listed and under the university, it's not always in our control. So we can do other things to bring communities on board with us. We've had a very traditional audience coming into our museums, which is probably no different from the rest of the country. But like the rest of the kind of heritage sector, we're also looking at, why are there particular communities who don't feel welcome? What are we doing internally? Because we can't always deflect and say that, they're out of our reach, they're hard to reach communities. Communities are there, they're functioning as they always do. In many ways, it's the job of people like me to see how is it that we are creating barriers, whether it is in access, whether it is in terms of language, whether it is in the timing also of how our museums are open sometimes. So that sort of was my initial sort of learning. And a lot of us across the museums are constantly talking about this, what are we doing in terms of engagement? How can we improve it? Are we sort of changing our language? Are we changing the way we approach groups? Is the way in which we are approaching groups, is it actually working? Is it actually appropriate? Are we safeguarding also groups that we're bringing on board for projects with us? Now, on the other hand, all this kind of work that's going on in the museums as well. So with this kind of project, it's not to say that the museums were never doing this work. I think it was happening across in different pockets. With this project, what happened is that it was a sort of combined effort really in many ways of all the museums coming together saying that, we're going to do this public programming, we're going to have an exhibition, we're going to sort of build towards changing our practice, changing the way in which we're looking at how we hire people or who we're getting in the museums, who actually is the face of our museums. So on the collection side, learning has always sort of been a very integral part of our museums. We've always had schools coming in. That's possibly one of our older kind of relationships. And because we also look at our museums as learning resources. So we have groups coming in. And sometimes when schools come in, they tend to be particular kind of schools. So then we start thinking, what are the other groups we're sort of missing out on? How can we make our museums more welcoming? How can we tailor our sessions to sort of be more relevant to them and not turn into this sort of very preachy that we tick all the outreach boxes and we're doing all the right things, because a lot of the times we do get things wrong. So with the Legacies project, the collections, the curatorial team, the learning team, they're sort of all working together to understand the ways in which we're looking at labels, the different kind of histories that are being told. The museums, because of space and because of limitations as well, tend to focus on particular objects, or the labels will just be descriptive. So now we're thinking, how are the other ways in which we can tell different narratives and different stories? because we need to make sure we're also appealing to young people, we're appealing to families, we're appealing to academics, because we are a university space, we're appealing to students. So I think that's also the point which is the most exciting, but also is the most challenging, because we're dealing with so many audiences and there is so much material out there that is being sort of investigated. But then again, museums, we don't have massive teams. Some of our museums are really small. There's possibly 3 or 4 members in that museum, and they're doing everything from learning to front of house to collections to exhibition. And obviously some of our museums are bigger, like the Fitzwilliam, which have a bigger team. But still, to get that kind of dedicated effort into researching stories that are linked to colonialism, to enslavement, then having our workforce sort of supported to be able to talk about such issues, and then also to develop the confidence with which they can then share some of that work with schools, with families, etc. And I think that's where a lot of the times conflict comes, because there is fear. There is fear in saying the wrong thing. There is fear from a lot of colleagues. I won't say a lot, some colleagues who feel like they're not really the people who should be sharing those stories. And I think it's made us as an organization more aware of where our strengths lie. Our strengths lie in working together. We have that kind of sharing of knowledges, experiences, and we're constantly learning from each other. But there is that also that kind of understanding of where we need sensitivity checks, where we need language checks that we can sort of lean on each other, but also being quite aware that as a workforce, we're not the most diverse. A lot of my colleagues will not feel that, and which is sometimes true. And it's really kind of, it is quite brave for some of them to also admit that, you know, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm privileged. Should I really be telling this story? Mm-hmm. But then if they don't tell those stories, possibly it's not reflected in the workforce, then nobody gets to tell those stories. Right. So it's sometimes also sort of balancing the way in which we can use our privilege, because we do have the opportunity to showcase particular stories. And I think that's where with this project, we're trying to also move very slowly towards community-led projects, where if that diversity is not reflected in our workforce, that diversity is definitely reflected in the communities of Cambridge or Cambridgeshire. So we can look to communities to sort of fill in some of those gaps. They might not be experts in history or archaeology or science or zoology, but they have their lived experiences. They have those connections with artifacts. They have their own personal narratives, and that actually makes it more exciting to engage with an object. So for instance, there are lots of, and this is an example I use with some of the kind of groups I help with my colleagues. When you enter the Fitzwilliam, there is a huge sort of armory section, and there are all these really ornate, really beautiful sort of weapons. And I was recently with a group, and they pointed out that, you know, for something so violent, it's really beautiful, these weapons. But then we look at the labels and you just see a description of what it's called, possibly where it's from, possibly the metal. But those weapons also have stories from their culture. They're not always associated with violence or with masculinity, which is what we tend to look at war and warfare with. But there are those kind of cultural nurturing stories that are linked with domesticity, with motherhood, with how women have kind of championed and protected their own, also in terms of gender fluidity. So all of those stories come through. And sometimes we get that from groups that we work with or communities who come on board who say, I have something very similar in my house, and it's purely decorative. It was passed on from my grandfather, for instance, or it was passed on from my father or something, or from my mother, who possibly, you know, used it as a protecting kind of symbol. So I think getting those stories makes it more exciting. It is a decolonial lens because it's shifting the way we look at objects and histories, because they can be personal. Museums are not the objective spaces we assume them to be. Fact in itself It's such a strange word, because what is fact? Facts change from culture to culture. So that same weapon that someone from Cambridge is coming in who's lived in Cambridge, and it looks like this sort of strange weapon from somewhere in, let's say, East Asia. But that whole context of that culture it comes from isn't there. And I think that's the opportunity we have through a project like this, and a project that could possibly change the way museums want to engage with their stories, that we can share snippets of the culture. It'll never be perfect. It'll never be all inclusive, because each individual has their own story. But if we offer that, then someone comes in and says, oh, this museum does have a story similar to mine, or it is a museum which is showing some bits of my culture. And it is a museum for me. It's not just a museum that sort of objectifies me and just puts me away under a sort of a glass cabinet. So I think that's the kind of challenge with a project like this. But also it's the exciting thing, and it's something that is slow, but it's something that we're seeing gradually happening through our collections. And that's how they're sort of navigating that contention of who has the power in a museum, and where the power has always sat in a museum. But if you have people willing to change it, the change is slow, but it happens. It's a really, really long-winded approach to your answer. I apologize.
No, that's great. It was a huge question anyway, and it's kind of, I know what I want to ask, but it's how do you go about that? Because it's so much. And I think what's exciting, and indeed what struck myself, my wife, and others that know you guys as a team, is that real genuine desire to want to listen, to learn, to bring about change. And I think there's a realism in terms of recognizing where the university and where the culture is at in this, or culture of cultures is at in this country, and working within that to afford change. So where there are gaps, you plug those. That doesn't mean you don't want to bring an overall change in terms of representation, but there's a recognition what it is at the moment. So how do we bring change with that? And I think that comes with sensitivity and also a recognition. Absolutely, we're not always going to get things right, but it's understanding, being gracious to hear when we haven't got things right, learn and move on. So I think it's really exciting what you guys are doing. I guess my next question in relation to all that is, how do you navigate a space like that beautiful sword or beautiful dagger, whatever it may be? And I think, just to add, that was really interesting that there's this whole context behind things which may not have anything to do with actually killing people. It's something else. But how do you navigate that space when, I don't know, someone may have bought that or someone nicked it, you know, because we've now taken this country. How do you navigate that with, do you give it back? Was it taken legitimately? If that was really significant to a family, you find out that it belonged to some royal family that maybe still been in existence. All these questions come to mind. How do you deal with that as a university, as a museum or series of museums?
So, okay, so let's say with things like repatriation or reparation, some of my colleagues obviously work more closely with that. But in my sort of day-to-day working with different groups, I get asked that question quite a bit. Why don't you just give it back? And sometimes a lot of people working in the museum will say yes. I mean, we are just guardians, and guardian seems like a really strange word. We are caretakers of objects, and I think within museums, sometimes people lose focus of that. We claim that sense of ownership over this object, but this object is steeped in a culture which has so many layers to it, and we don't have ownership over that culture. But in the way in which we talk about it, sometimes we do assert a sense of kind of ownership, if that makes sense. So for instance, if you're coming into a museum and you've never traveled to a particular part of the world, and you see this object and a certain history being depicted, I mean, we all know that museums haven't always got it right. So it might be misleading, it might be derogatory in the way it talks about a particular culture. We have within our collections as well, and something that a lot of our colleagues are working to change, the way in which catalogs have been done and the way in which object stories have been told. Objects can be or can depict quite racist things, quite sort of anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-sort of different kinds of sexuality. It can be quite problematic. And I think when those objects sit in our museums, sometimes we see those barriers that changing labels might be slightly more kind of administrative or quite convoluted in how it happens. But I think where a lot of my work has come in is we can facilitate those conversations. We've had sort of people come into the museum and say that, I've looked at something, it really shouldn't be here. It is really, really problematic how you're talking about it. And not just in the context of our museums, in museums across London as well and across the country. And then it's this dialogue, and I've seen different museums approach it in different ways. And I think the sector that ways does offer the opportunity to share that kind of knowledge. And different museums have a different kind of relationship with power. In our museums, most of my team members, I won't get into the other kind of specific museums, but most of our team members will say that that power really shouldn't sit with us, that power should be given back to source communities, to communities where those objects come from. But the process of repatriation and reparation, until a request is made, it can't sort of be carried through. And now within that as well, we have these kind of sessions. So we have obviously at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the Benin bronzes, and that's been sort of talked about quite publicly across the sector and in this country. And they're sort of in the process of being returned as well. And sometimes we have people coming in and they'll talk to us and they'll say, that's really, really amazing. But because they don't see a lot of public facing things, a lot of people will also assume that nothing's happening, that we've just sort of clung on to it. At the same time, we'll also have communities saying that it shouldn't go back. They will say things like, but over here, I have access to it. My children have access to it. My children's children will have access to it. If it goes back to whichever country it goes back to, it will disappear. It will not be looked after. We won't have access to it. And I think sometimes people in Cambridge and Cambridgeshire also forget, or sometimes don't understand their privilege in how they get to access our museums, or not access it as well. They have that lack of representation. But in that debate around returning things, we often face that because you have both the for and the against that we're constantly sort of dealing with. And people obviously want to voice their opinions. But I think when you look at how we're discussing objects through our project and how a lot of my colleagues will talk about it is quite open to that dialogue. If communities want to deal with objects in a particular way, they'll be quite sort of inviting. You want to come, you want to kind of bring in members, you want to sort of talk about the objects, you want to talk about the process of returning it. They're quite open to it, but the whole process of it is quite convoluted. I'm sure my colleagues will do a better job of explaining it. Sometimes I also find it a bit too complex. But with the kind of process it has to follow, it can take a long time. And people want things to happen instantly. Don't blame them. We all want change to happen overnight or the next week. That would be great if it did. But I think we then have to sort of navigate that in-between space where we're thinking, this is an object. Is it going to get returned? Is it not going to return? But while we have it, what can we do with it? Can we create an environment where people can actually openly sort of discuss it? Can we bring in groups? Can we ask them their opinion? Can that opinion then sort of impact the way in which we display it? And I think that's what we try to do through this project. Try to sort of have young students who sometimes have come to us who haven't really learned about empire or understand the kind of complexity because they haven't learned about it. So then we're sort of talking about, okay, this is how I'll explain empire to you. This is how, let's say, you would look at empire today. And then they'll ask questions like, but why does it have to be returned? It's here now. It's sitting here. We're looking after it. So then we have to go a little more personal, saying that, give me one of your objects. And what if now it belongs to me? I've taken it. They'll be like, but you can't take it. I'm like, but what do you think museums have done? It was a very colonial mindset to just go into a space and just pick something up and showcase it in a particular way. And undoing that, years of sort of museums functioning like that will take such a long time. But we can, in the immediate, change the way people understand it. It doesn't always work. Some young children will just go away thinking we just put them through such a ridiculous exercise. But sometimes we'll take away objects and we'll say, okay, now it's in a museum. Make a case for why this object should go back to you. And it's quite remarkable to see them sort of shift because it's something personal now. So they've made that immediate connection. And they're like, it should come back to me because it's mine. And I'm like, do you think that would work in a museum? What if all these communities are saying it's mine? And what if in that community, different individuals have a different stance? How does the museum then decide who should it go to? Or if it goes back, where will it sit? Things like that. And I think I found that really interesting because that same format can work with some of our colleagues as well, who have been working in the museums in different sort of departments, who know of decolonization, but because decolonization can be quite academic in its approach, that practical sort of, we've missed a step somewhere in understanding what it is. And so we approach it this way. What happens when something personal is taken away? Something that means something to you, but I've now put behind a case and just said, it's a piece of cloth made of cotton, has embroidery from 2022 from Cambridge. But your history, your story, your attachment to it, that your mother or your father stitched it for you and gave it to you, none of that context exists. So now, do you still think that the museum should have this? That your museum is based purely on sort of fact and is very objective in its stance, and that it's a neutral space? And I think that's where we're trying to sort of change the way in which people engage with museums, while obviously the larger complex issues of where our collections have come from, how they've reached here, sometimes through very contentious links, through very contentious funding with people who've had connections to the slave trade, to the East India Company. So while those bigger changes happen, I think there are layers of where we're trying to sort of change perspective and approach. So at the smaller layers with younger audiences, with older audiences, we try and approach it that way. So at least those conversations continue to happen while those bigger changes may or may not happen.
Wow. It's such a huge thing, isn't it? And it could be so easy just to say, well, oh, that's so much time ago and let's move on. But I think, particularly this country, I don't think we have fully what's the word, sort of reviewed or acknowledged or taken on board the power of empire. I mean, it's quite shocking. You think, really, it's not actually that long ago at all. And even if you watch newsreels from like 50, 60 years ago, empire still exists. And it just looking back, it looks so different to how it does today. And I think perhaps the mindset was so different. Oh, I'll just take that and not really think about it. It's, it's just an object. But we've seen it's a lot more complex than that. It's more than just an object. It's the story. It's like reading, if you think, on a page a list of names. If you see them on some memorial or save records or Holocaust, all of this stuff, they're just names on a page. You're not recording the stories of those people, the lives that they've lived, the things that they've done. I mean, just going through it, we were talking earlier, doing the family tree, and you just see all these names, but who were they? Who were these people? What did they do? What were their relationships like? So it's a huge task that you have before you. And how do you manage people's reactions? How do you work through that?
I don't think I always do a very good job of managing expectations, Mark. I'll be very honest. I think quite a few of us sometimes approach it also from a very kind of idealistic, we can do everything because we want to do everything. I found in sort of working here and working across the country as well that we try and kind of separate our personal identities from work, but I see the kind of way in which decolonization works in the sector and in our organization as well. Sometimes a lot of the work falls on people or staff of color. And so it's that kind of emotional burden as well, because you're trying to separate your personal and professional, but there is a bleeding. And sometimes that bleeding is not very well managed, at least not with me. So when we have these conversations and when we're dealing with sort of groups and communities, it is so natural sometimes for those stories to weave themselves. But at the same time, you're also trying to safeguard that kind of personal bit of yourself. But then groups respond, because sometimes people will come to me and say that, it's really nice to see if there's sort of some from my community as well, someone from the community in a museum space doing projects like this. And in those moments, it feels quite sad sometimes, because there are just a handful of us. And sometimes it also feels nice that, at least you felt comfortable enough to be able to say that to me, and that you might be encouraged to come into the museum because there are people like me there. So in that kind of navigating these ideas and tensions, sometimes we get difficult people, as you do in any job. I sometimes have had people sort of ask strange questions with no understanding of really where I'm from, what really my work is, commenting on, oh, your English is, how is your English so good? And sometimes you just want to say, well, my country was colonized by this for a couple of years, and we've gone through a lot of trauma in our educational system and in the way in which the country approaches learning, and English being championed above everything else. And sometimes you take a step back when you have that kind of energy to sort of shift it around, saying, why, what would you assume I would be more fluent in? And sometimes with younger groups, it can open up a conversation around stereotypes. And then, when you look at someone and you assume they're from a particular place, do you see their representation in a museum or in any kind of heritage and culture? But sometimes you're just too exhausted and you just really want to shield yourself. And I see quite a few colleagues battling with that sort of tension, because it's important work. It's important work that everyone's doing. But we're not always safeguarding ourselves, because we're also learning as we sort of go along, because a lot of the things are new to us. So for instance, even with me, I constantly find myself learning about language. So terms that we throw around just to no end, you begin to realize how problematic. And I think an example is, I was in sort of a working on consultation, and I think I'd mentioned other stories, and someone sort of corrected me on that and said, I get what you're saying, but when you say other stories, that in itself is othering, and you're doing exactly what you're saying you don't want to do. And it took me a few seconds, and I was like, you're absolutely right. We've just had this entire kind of discussion around, narratives, where museums limit narratives and that we should have more multivocality. And here I've gone and said this particular thing. And it's sometimes we discuss this in our team. It's how you approach it. It would have been so easy for me to be embarrassed and be like, oh, I didn't actually mean that. And, put up a barrier. But it is that kind of honest way in which you're just like, oh, you're right. I catch myself constantly having to check the way in which I use language. So for me, I run it by colleagues that, I came across this term and it was problematic. How have the museums been talking about it? And we then bounce off each other. So it is this never-ending pool of sort of knowledge that we're constantly accumulating, because language changes so fast. Yeah. And I think that's something that we're trying to do through this project, is change the way in which we talk about these objects. And that, yes, this is the dominant narrative, but there are lots of other ways of talking about this object. And it doesn't mean one way is correct. It just means that we will try as much as we can to offer you as many perspectives. And then you decide which one you really want to remember, you want to react to, you want to reflect on. But then in that as well, there are mistakes that we make, and then we learn. But we can never learn unless you make it and then someone points it out to you, which is where I think engagement is so important in the museums. Because unless someone points it, and it's just a general discussion that I'm having with someone, or it might be a slightly more formal workshop I'm doing, but I'm feeding off not just from this pool across the kind of university museums and the kind of wider heritage sector, but also people who live in Cambridge or live in Cambridgeshire. or possibly live in Suffolk where I live, and we're kind of comparing notes and learning, and it's really exhausting. But it also makes it exciting because there is never an end to that learning, which is slightly terrifying. But sometimes I wake up and I think, oh, every day I come to the museum, I learn something new. It might be in the office, it might be in the museum sort of that I walk into. But I take those stories and then I'll pass it along, and I'll pass it along to someone else, and hopefully they'll pass it along. And then there is a different perspective that's being created. And I think sometimes if we try with the kind of work we're doing, it can be really hard-hitting stories, really, really difficult stories of enslavement, of kind of trauma. And while it's important to talk about those stories, sometimes it's also important to talk about or create a space where we can just reflect and sometimes even laugh about some of the objects and just kind of have that dialogue, because it is so heavy going sometimes. And I think there is a bit of contention that, you're doing this kind of work with decolonization. It should only be serious because those are the kind of stories. But you can learn about it in a kind of interesting way, in a more kind of interactive way. It can be a dialogue that is supported by people around you. It doesn't have to be this kind of one way that this is a really problematic history and this is how we kind of need to kind of go ahead with it. But actually, there are lots of other stories that accommodate that. And I think that makes it more approachable for people, because with the project and with kind of decolonization, sometimes the word itself can be a barrier for people. They're like, oh, it's theory. I don't understand it. It's not relevant to me at all. I work with a particular collection that doesn't really have any sort of links with this. And that's really not true. But then you shift the perspective and you tell them, oh, do you want to tell me your sort of engagement with this object? Or is there this narrative that comes in, which is not the dominant narrative? And that's all it is. It's just providing those many ways of looking at an object. And I think that's something easier for people to understand than saying that, we're going to approach it through the lens of colonialism and all of that. So it's also pitching it at the right level. And that's something I'm constantly sort of learning as I go along. And I think some of my team members are also learning as well. We pitch something, it doesn't work. We're like, okay, we know this is not going to work. Never try it with that group again. Let's tune it to something different.
But there's that whole thing again, isn't there? It's about listening, engaging and learning. And I think, what you said there about not getting defensive, recognizing we get things wrong and understanding is really important, because that's to be honest, that's how relationships grow. It's about being real with one another. I think also there's that whole thing about history is messy, and as individuals we can get into pigeonholing people. So I'll give an example. So recently, a really, really good book about Mary Seacole. There's an excellent film coming out later this year. And I felt the book was really well balanced in that it painted a picture, warts and all. So it didn't idolize in terms of she was an absolutely perfect woman, but it showed the positive and negatives. And I think it's very easy for us to champ. So people idolize Florence Nightingale, for example, and there's these comparisons made between the two. And when you read the language of both women, there are things in there that I find quite problematic in terms of the language that Florence Nightingale was using was very racist and but also very class-ridden. Really, really, really quite offensive. But then I look at some of the language that Mary Seacole was using, and clearly she was using language of the victor. She was an imperialist. I mean, she considers herself British absolutely in the sense of part of the empire, but she valued things about the empire. She spoke about other people of color in a derogatory way. So, and by no means am I saying that's okay, but it's trying to understand the context and the time these people were in, but also recognizing they did both do good work. Now, how much they did of each and how you want to revere them and what impact that's something else. But the reality is, if you look at facts and forget about the words that they've used, they did have a positive impact on the environment around them. I'm sure if you were to look at abolitionists who had a major impact, in fact, I think, and forgive me, I don't know loads about Florence Nightingale, but in many senses, I think her background was in that, or some of her family were abolitionists. But again, if you then look at the language that's being used, it doesn't marry up. So it's not that there's one person that's all right and all wrong, and they're all great and they're all bad. It's a mess. People are people, and I think we have to be careful when we look at, I know we're going off piece a little bit, we look at individuals, we have to think of over a life, over the impact what they've done, because you could read a diary entry of someone who's 18 and you could read a diary entry of the same person when they're 68, and they could be very different people, or have and it seems paradoxical. And I guess maybe the same as with Empire, maybe there were people who absolutely were logging things with an aim to preserve history, but not actually thinking about the fact you've just nicked that from a family that was it was something really important to them, like, I don't know, an iPhone or whatever that you've taken from a child. Well, you haven't taken, you've given it back, right? I hope so. You don't have a drawer full of iPhones or whatever, I hope.
Just sitting. So, with museums, I think sometimes people assume we're neutral spaces because we tell narratives and stories in a particular way. And I think, as you're saying, with individuals, I mean, we in ourselves are so messy. Sometimes we're doing things that we think are right. Sometimes we're doing things that are terribly wrong. But I think what we also try to do in our museums is if we can try to present a slightly more holistic picture of what this individual did, and museums don't always do that. We tend to focus on particular time periods. It tends to be key moments in that person's history, key moments, obviously, that a particular institution might want to be remembered. But let's say, for instance, with the abolitionists that we're looking at around Cambridge as well, with people like Equiano, students, key Black figures like Bridge Tower. I think through exhibitions and through the ways in which we tell stories, we can present that picture, whether that picture is sort of celebrating them for particular things, or is also trying to say that there are these murkier things, whether they were or not. Similarly with abolitionists like Wilberforce and Clarkson, these things that they did, but then they also had these other bits to them. And I think if museums can do that, if we can provide as much of a perspective, we obviously can't know what their entire life was. We can't tell an entire story. It'll probably fill up an entire gallery or museum. But if we can try to tell part of that story, and then that's where other things come in, like projects come in, or smaller exhibitions come in, or workshops come in, where what we can't do in the physical space, we can do slightly removed, where we can have discussions around particular people or particular objects or particular cultures. And then it's up to the participants, the audience or the community members to really understand where they want to position themselves, or where they also want to give a bit of feedback in how we should be telling those stories. And that's something we're finding more and more with our work, is that once we begin, I mean, we've always had relationships, but once we begin to have more relationships with different people, and we start to do things in a particular way, it is that kind of faith building and building trust, where some groups will say, oh, I didn't actually realize you wanted to work with a group like us. And that sometimes it's in the way we've positioned ourselves as well. Perhaps there is someone who had been working with a group, but because of the way in which our hiring practices are in place, or the way in which our funding works, that person might have left, or that funding might have ended for that project. So that work has sort of ended. So that sustained engagement that a lot of museums hope for isn't always achieved. But it's in those kind of relationships that we can start building and talking and gathering sort of information from around this place. So for instance, if it's something on Equiano, like the Equiano Bridge was launched recently, because it's linked to Chesterton and where his daughter was buried. how many people actually know about that story or deemed it valuable enough to know? It took two groups, Circle of Change and Cambridge African Network, working with the council to have that concentrated effort to now sort of talking about Equiano's life. Subsequently, in the museums as well, we've been looking at Equiano's life and the kind of work he was doing around Cambridgeshire, the work of his family as well, the areas he lived in. So there are, and these two connections start working together. There might be someone else in the university who's looking at Cambridge and slavery and doing research around that. They might be linked. There might be another group who's sort of looking at the way in which abolitionists functioned in the country. And I think we can provide those connections, and then we can try and make it as public facing and invite people to that dialogue. So we don't become the only ones who tell you a particular version of history. And I think that's where the problems with museums sit. We guard those histories, sometimes unintentionally, really, but we become those custodians because we're telling a story. So that's the right story because that particular museum said it. When it was just someone in the exhibition or the curator or the researcher who found out this story. But then as more of these stories are being told, there's more research, and then we continue to kind of update our knowledge as we go along. And I think that's where it's a very roundabout way of kind of responding to you. But that's the bits we can do. We can't force people to assume a particular perspective, but we can try and offer as much fact and hold our cards sort of on the table saying that, you know, we don't know. It might change in a month or so because we'll come across new information. But this is what we have. Let's have this discussion. Or this is kind of what we're doing. Or we're trying to sort of do walks over here or workshops over there or a talk over here. And try and make it as inclusive. Again, access to our museums and the things we offer does have its challenges. And we try and sort of navigate that as best as we can, and each museum does it. But I think that's how we can try to sort of give as much of a picture as we can. And then again, it's always up to that person, how much they want to sort of engage with and how much they want to then come and say, oh, possibly I want to do a project about this with your museum. And that's the goal, that people will feel that there is that relationship, that they can work with organizations like us, organizations that have kind of historically not always welcomed those kind of communities. So yes, I think that's where we can try and really, I guess, not really present a very clear picture of what this person is and what their life is, but present as much as a picture, and then not safeguard those stories that sometimes do sit in our collections historically. And you'll find that when you talk to people who are sort of in research, in collections, and curators, that there are so many stories that have just been sort of sitting there. And now with kind of newer people coming in or a fresh perspective or the same curators going back to it, they're like, there are these stories, we can tell those stories. How can we tell those stories? Let's start a dialogue.
Wow. Look, I could continue to talk to you all day, and I've still got questions I want to ask, but I'm really mindful of your time. So look, I really want to thank you, Ruchika, for really opening up a can of worms and sort of analysing each of those worms to a certain extent. And I'm sure that we could do a follow-up podcast at some point. But thank you, really appreciate that.
No, thank you so much, Mark. I understand sometimes I realize this. Because of the nature of this work, some of my answers are always so vague. Sometimes I catch myself saying things that I'm trying to be clear about, but because I'm sort of trying to be mindful of not always safeguarding information the same way we don't want our museums to function, a lot of our work comes across as sort of, you know, it's a construct, and sometimes it seems a bit abstract. And then when you actually, so the things like you've come on board with, so, you know, the power walk came out of that. There were these stories, they are being changed sort of internally, but what can we do immediately that people can access it? And I think that then takes a lot of kind of things that I say that are slightly vague, but makes it more practical. And then when people come on those walks and they hear some of the stories, they're like, oh, you're doing all of this work. I'm like, we've always been doing this work. It's just sometimes in how we present it to the public, it can take a very long time. And I think it's more of sort of projects like that. And, you know, we have the community panel that you've come on board with. There are consultation work sort of we're trying to do more of. And I think those are there's slightly less vague ways of talking about things, which are possibly more useful for people. But then again, I'm always opening cans. And I think that's just the nature of this job. But thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Been lovely talking to you too. I will just do the wrap up and then I'll stop recording and ask you to stop. I need to go.
It's too much, Mark. I've thrown too much vagueness at you.
Okay. As always, thank you for listening to The Active Listener. Please do feel free to subscribe, like and share. And I look forward to listening to someone new. Thank you. Well done. You know that it's.
Was that what you were expecting, Mark?
It's probably more than I was expecting.